Back before my head injury, my husband and I had this cheesy ritual. If I ever got held up late at the office and needed to catch the last train home, he'd wait for me at the station and accidentally brush against me as I disembarked at the platform. He'd put on a bashful voice, acting like we were meeting for the first time, and say, "I'm sorry I bumped into you, ma'am. It's just you've the most distracting green eyes. Could I maybe walk you home?" And every damn time, it made me melt like butter in a hot pan. Yes, I know I'm lame. But one night, the platform was empty when those automatic doors hissed shut behind me. My stomach lurched. Exiting the station, a concrete set of stairs spat you out into a long, filthy, poorly lit underground tunnel. And this was the real reason for Darren and I's tradition, because neither of us liked the idea of me walking home by myself. As my calls went unanswered, I stood there, my leg bouncing up and down. Lamp posts flicked on beyond the iron fence surrounding the station, and the sky grew darker until, finally, I saw no choice other than to set off as quickly as I could. Inside the underpass, sputtering halogen bulbs were spaced out every 10 meters or so. I half-walked, half-jogged from one flickering pool of light to the next, inhaling through my mouth to avoid the combined stink of 1,000 relieved bladders. Halfway along, a rapid skitter of footsteps rushed up behind me. I spun around. My chest collided with something solid. Then 2 hands shot out and grabbed me by the wrists. In the dim light, I could make out dark hair and a set of deep blue eyes. I heaved a giant sigh of relief. "Darren." "Darling," the man answered. Altogether, the hairs along my arms and neck stood on end. It wasn't my husband. My brain went into full-blown panic mode, which means the rest of the encounter is still a giant blur, but I know I lashed out with punches and kicks. My fingernails raked the man's left eye and gouged his nose. He kept yelling something, but it was impossible to hear beneath my screams bouncing off the walls. At one point, I bit down on his hand, hard, and his skin's rough texture is the part clearest in my mind. After that, there are images of me lying in a gathering pool of blood while the man apologizes, and if I really squint my memory, there's confused glimpses of sharp teeth intermixed with a haze of darkness. From there, everything jump cuts to a ring of empty faces towering over me. Those faces were like the expressionless mannequins you see in shop windows. With my heart in my throat, I thrashed around in a soft bed, screaming until the mannequins rushed to restrain me. Then I rode off into a wave of blackness. Next time the world slid into focus, a single mannequin was beside my bed, dressed in a nurse's uniform. A soft, disembodied voice came floating along, promising everything would be okay. From somewhere close by, the continuous beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor gathered speed, and gradually, I realized I was in a hospital. I swallowed a lump and asked the nurse what happened to her face. The voice asked what I meant. I said the nurse's skull looked as if, when God designed her, he'd loaded up Photoshop and gone crazy with the smudge tool. It was a smooth mound of pink flesh. The faceless nurse explained I'd suffered a serious head injury and showered me with kindness and support while a series of torches got shown in my eyes and my vitals got checked a dozen or so times. The voice kept telling me not to move around too much, otherwise the stitches across the top of my head might have popped loose. Another figure with an empty skull, this one dressed in a doctor's coat, came and stood at the foot of my bed. And that's when I first heard the term prosospagnosia, also known as face blindness. The condition can result from a traumatic brain injury. What followed was a flurry of activity. Darren, who I only recognized by his haircut and voice, was allowed to sit with me. I squeezed his hand throughout the onslaught of tears and endless visits from neurologists. On his way to the station the night of the attack, Darren had seen a newly licensed teen driver slam on their brakes way too late to stop at a red light. An old lady got sent careening into the air, and Darren called for an ambulance while he applied pressure to the poor woman's chest to keep her from bleeding out. That was the reason he missed my calls. A woman named Tracy and her German Shepherd, Buster, were drawn to the tunnel by my screams. Tracy sicked Buster on my attacker, who bolted off in the direction of the station, covered in my blood. Both Tracy and Buster visited me at the hospital, and we posed for a photo which made the front page of the local newspaper. The story about a hero dog included a blurb about my condition, even though we specifically asked the reporter not to include it. Two police officers, who I could only distinguish by their difference in height, questioned me about my attacker. Judging by their irritated voices, they'd hoped to learn more than his hair looked sorta like Darren's. Although it took days of interrogation, I convinced Darren to reveal what else authorities knew about the man. It turned out after Buster chased him to the platform, the bastard took off running along the curved track. Tracy called the police, who went after him, flashlights in hand, but only discovered a discarded backpack a quarter-mile north. So far as anybody could tell, my attacker dropped it, climbing a fence to escape into the loading bay of a warehouse. Inside the pack, they found creep shots of me, along with journal entries and love letters filled with strange details about our supposed relationship. The officers said he might have been stalking me for as long as half a year, living out a fantasy in which we were husband and wife. Their promises they'd have him in custody soon rang a little hollow. In the weeks I spent confined to the ward, I got a crash course in how difficult life with prosopagnosia really is. Dressed in their identical hospital gowns, my fellow patients were impossible to tell apart unless they had a unique feature, like green nail polish, and I suffered a mild panic attack every time somebody in my inner circle changed their hairstyle or bought a new outfit. After a whirlwind of scans and tests, the doctor suggested I should consult a specialist, although I could tell they hadn't much faith I would ever recover. Good thing I never wanted to be a police sketch artist. Because some of the creep shots were taken from the back garden, Darren and I moved to a new house on the opposite side of town. Anytime I caught a glimpse of my reflection, my pulse launched into the stratosphere, so I insisted we not keep any mirrors. Early one morning, a fortnight later, a stranger with a profile matching my attacker's knocked on the front door. I'd already grabbed a vase that sat on a nearby side table when, in a silly voice, Darren said he was sorry to bother me, but that I had the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen and presented me with a bouquet of roses. He was teasing me again, playing make-believe like old times. Now on the verge of a heart attack, I told him I needed to sit. He apologized 1,000 times. I told him it was okay, but that I'd prefer we never did that silly role-play game ever again. He of course agreed. In the weeks that followed, my confidence in my ability to read people swelled. Everybody had a tell, be it a tendency to wear noisy jewelry or a compulsive habit of scratching their ear. In time, I adapted to this new way of seeing, or not seeing, the world. Until tonight. There we were, watching Rick and Morty in the bedroom. I'd never liked cartoons before, but since the diagnosis, live-action stuff had become tricky to follow, so I gravitated towards anything with bright colors and distinct patterns. Afterwards, as I lay facing the wall and scrolling through Reddit, Darren pulled on his navy robe and shuffled off downstairs to use the bathroom. I was still reading the same post when footsteps came marching along the hall. Straight away, my skin prickled. Why? Was it the speed? Or maybe the rhythm? As the door creaked open, I glanced over at Darren, still in his robe. By the time he crossed the room and slid in next to me, my spine was slicked with sweat. I could still smell the woody scent of his cologne. So what set off the alarm bells in my mind? As an arm reached out and coiled around my stomach, my heart thrashed against my chest. At the corner of my eye, a blank face stared straight at me, silent and unmoving. The way that rough hand probed my stomach and the taste of those foul breaths, It all evoked memories of the tunnel. I rolled toward the wall, suddenly trapped beneath the hot cavern of bedclothes. And that brings us to now. I can't tell if I'm being paranoid or if the figure beside me is my stalker, posing as my husband. If it is my stalker, he must have learned about my condition from the article and is living out his fantasy. I'm afraid what might happen if I run or call the police. I'm not even letting myself think about what happened to Darren. But it could also be I'm freaking out over nothing, like before. There's no way to be sure without making it obvious I'm suspicious. So I'm just gonna lie here pretending to browse Reddit until whoever's beside me's breaths fall into a slow, rhythmic pattern. Then I'll slip away as quietly as I can. So if you don't hear from me again, you'll know my instincts were correct. Wish me luck. Justin and I had been together for 10 years, married for 6. I'd been with him for my whole adult life. We'd been dating since I was 17 and he was 18. I always thought he was my soulmate, the man I wanted to grow old with. Turns out I was wrong. I was devastated when I found out. Yes, Justin had been staying out later than usual, and his explanations were usually flimsy at best. I'm not stupid. I had my suspicions, but I think I just really didn't want to come to terms with the fact that my husband was seeing another woman. Honestly, I might have gone years without discovering the truth. But Justin got sloppy. "Welcome home, honey. Fun night out with the guys after work again." "Uh-huh," Justin grumbled, brushing past me. "I made dinner if you're hungry. Beef tips and rice. I know it's one of your favorites." "Ate at the bar. I'm going to bed," he muttered, steadying himself against the wall before woozily clomping up the stairs. My heart sank. Nights like those were becoming more and more frequent. I loved my husband. All I wanted was to spend a little quality time with him after a long day at work, but he couldn't even spare me a few minutes. I glanced up at him as he lumbered up the steps, a tear trickling down my cheek. In an instant, any sadness that I felt was replaced with burning rage. Because when Justin passed underneath the overhead light, I saw what appeared to be a hickey on the side of his neck. A cocktail of emotions swirled within me. Despair, resentment, betrayal. They all hit me like a ton of bricks. I was stunned. I didn't know what to do. I mean, who would? The man I had been head over heels for all that time had stabbed me in the back. I was in disbelief. I stumbled to the kitchen, pulling out a chair before I could collapse. I stared into space, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I sat there for a long time, deep in thought. After a while, I felt numb, like my entire personality had been flushed down the drain, leaving nothing but an empty husk. Then, a thought flashed across my mind. I'd been mistaken. That had to be it. Just a mere trick of the light. It was a pretty dimly lit hallway, after all. Whatever the case, I had to know. I tiptoed upstairs, abandoning my dinner. I crept up to our room as quiet as a church mouse, before lightly pushing open the bedroom door. Justin was fast asleep. I didn't waste any time. I rushed across the room, careful to avoid any squeaky floorboards, and I inspected Justin's neck. His snores grew louder as I approached. He always was a heavy sleeper. I cursed when I got a closer look. Justin was sleeping on his side, and I was not going to try to roll him over. I glanced around, searching for anything that might provide concrete evidence. My eyes fell to the bedside table. Bingo. I snatched Justin's phone from his charger. I held my breath as I pressed his meaty thumb onto the screen to unlock it. I grinned, feeling a rush of exhilaration as I achieved my goal. What? I froze. Justin groggily opened his eyes a sliver as my hand hovered over him. My blood turned to ice, and I prayed with all my might that my husband would just go back to sleep. To my immense shock, my prayers were answered. Justin mumbled incoherently under his breath before grabbing a fistful of covers and nodding off. I'd escaped by the skin of my teeth. I had to be more careful. The first thing I did was check Justin's texts. I immediately saw a woman's name I didn't recognize. My heart shattered when I read the messages. "Hey baby, last night was incredible. See you again after work today. You're damn right. I wish you never had to leave. What about that wife of yours, though? Won't she get suspicious? Her? Not a chance. Even if she does find out, she won't leave. I could murder a baby in front of her, and she'd still think I was a saint." A deep-seated rage bubbled within me. Did Justin really think that little of me? He clearly saw me as nothing more than a spineless, codependent pushover. Well, I'd show him. I screenshotted the evidence, scrolling through dozens of nude photos that I hadn't taken, and sent everything to my number. I deleted any proof of my snooping, then replaced Justin's phone on the charger. I stormed out of the room, grabbing my keys as I went. I made it halfway across the living room when the realization hit me. I had nowhere to go. All my family lived 7 hours away. It was too late to book a decent hotel, and I really didn't want to drag any of my friends into my drama. Not yet, at least. That left me with one option. I had to sleep on the couch. I plopped down onto the sofa and sighed. I didn't want to have to confront it, but I knew what I had to do. In the morning, I was going to find a lawyer and start the divorce process. The thought alone was enough to break me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. I cried like a baby, silently sobbing into a scratchy pillow for what must have been hours. My eyes were puffy by the time I was done. I couldn't fathom falling asleep in a state like that, but I must have at some point. Because the next thing I remember, sunlight was flooding through the blinds. "Morning, babe. How'd you—" The rest of the sentence caught in my throat. That was right. Justin and I were about to be over. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, tears stinging at the corners of my vision. I opened up the texts I'd sent myself as proof that the past 12 hours hadn't been some twisted nightmare. But the messages were gone. My eyes grew wide as I stared at the screen. That couldn't be right. They'd been there, clear as day the night before. Something wasn't adding up. I suddenly paused, bolting upright. Was that breakfast? The tantalizing aroma of eggs and bacon wafted around the corner from the kitchen. My brows furrowed. Justin never cooked. My breathing was shallow as I tentatively shuffled toward the kitchen. Curiosity gnawed at me like a piranha. I apprehensively peeked around the corner, unsure of what I would find. To my shock, there was my husband, humming a little tune while flipping pancakes. I rubbed my eyes. Was I seeing things? Surely I was delusional from lack of sleep. That had to have been it. Then, Justin turned, his icy blue eyes locking onto mine. "Morning, princess. I hope you're hungry. I saw you sleeping on the couch, and I thought you might not be feeling well, so I decided to make you a hot meal to help you get better." My heart skipped a beat. Was this really my husband? It looked like him. Sounded like him too. Still, I was weary. Yeah. Just feeling a little under the weather is all. Are you feeling okay? You're acting different. Never been better. Honestly, I think I've really turned a new leaf, he said, placing a steaming plate before me. The old Justin is kaput. From now on, I swear, I'm going to be the best husband I can be. Our gazes connected, and I searched his expression for answers. He seemed genuine. If this was an act, it was a damn good one. Thanks, babe. That really makes me happy to hear. Justin beamed at me, the warmth of his smile seeping into my heart. It had been years since he looked at me like that. Well, get used to it, because I'm keeping my word. I love you, Lydia. I wanted to be suspicious. I wanted to remain silent. I wanted to keep my guard up. But how could I? All I needed was love and attention, and I was finally getting it. For the first time in a long time, it felt like my husband actually cared. I love you too, Justin, I muttered, before digging into my meal. A big part of me was still leery of my husband. His timing was pretty convenient after all. But even with all my doubts, Justin was seemingly sticking to his promise. He took me out on dates, paid to get my nails done, bought me flowers. He even started shouldering most of the housework. Needless to say, I was impressed. If he would have kept that up, I might have never suspected a thing. But one night he slipped up. We were cuddled up on the couch, watching The Truman Show, when I asked. Now I wish I would have kept my mouth shut. "Hey, babe." "Yes, my love," Justin asked, his eyes still glued to the screen. If someone close to you was an imposter, like a perfect replica except for a few tiny changes, do you think you'd notice? Justin tensed up, his eyes wide as he slowly turned to face me. A blank stare had overtaken his expression. A chill rippled through my body when he looked at me like that. He was beginning to frighten me. "I suppose so. Why do you ask?" His voice was monotone, dripping with a tinge of urgency. I didn't know how to process his sudden shift in personality. It's the premise of the movie we're watching. I watched as the color seeped back into his face, and he loosened up, breathing a sigh of relief. I cocked a curious brow. Why was he acting so strange? That makes sense. We sat there in uncomfortable silence, shifting our attention back to the TV screen. After a few more tense moments, I couldn't take it anymore. "I've got to use the restroom and charge my phone. I'll be right back. No need to pause the movie for me." Justin nodded before grinning up at me. His smile. Had his teeth always been that straight? "Okay, baby girl, hurry back. Wouldn't want your spot to get cold." "Yeah, sure thing." I practically bolted up the stairs, locking myself in our room. I slumped against the door, trying to steady my palpitating heart. What was going on? Was it just me, or was that some seriously freaky behavior? Either way, I needed a second to calm down. I had my eyes shut, focusing on my breathing, when I heard it. My phone was buzzing from inside my pocket. I hurriedly retrieved it, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. I normally don't answer calls from strangers, but something compelled me. Maybe it was intuition, or perhaps I just wanted someone to talk to other than my husband. In the end, I accepted the call. Hello? Lydia Atkins. Speaking. Look, this is going to sound crazy, but I need you to hear what I have to say. Okay? I suddenly jolted up from my spot on the floor and stared at the locked door separating me from the hallway. Loud knocks rattled it in its frame. Lydia, who are you speaking to?" Panic surged through me as I scrambled for an answer. It's my mom. Go back downstairs, I'll be there in a minute." "That was him, wasn't it?" the caller said. "That was my husband, yes. Why do you ask?" I whispered, putting as much distance between myself and the door as possible. "Lydia, I need you to hear me out. Can you promise me that you will?" The pounding on the opposite side of the room grew even louder. "Lydia, don't listen to her. She's a fucking liar." My stomach began to twist itself into knots. How did he know? "I'm listening. I'll hear what you have to say." The woman on the other end of the line breathed an audible sigh of relief. "Okay. My name is Adeline, and Justin and I have been seeing each other for about 9 months. That man in your house is not your husband." My blood turned to ice, and I began to tremble. Number that couldn't be true. In a shaky voice, I asked the question that will haunt me until I die. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" There was a long pause, the bangs outside my door reaching a nauseating crescendo. When Adeline answered, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was in serious danger. "Lydia, for the past week, Justin has been living with me." I stared, mouth dry, heart pounding, at the message from my boss. That awful combination of words that my coworkers and I pray we never see. You're in the running for Employee of the Year. For him to send something so callous via email that was just rubbing salt in the wound. My eyes glazed over the wall of text that followed. I didn't need to read the details. I'd cleaned enough of the prior winners off the walls and ceiling of the soundproofed break room to know exactly what the award entailed. After that initial, deep pang of fear faded, denial flooded in to take its place. I wasn't just hitting my sales quota. I was blowing it out of the damn water, selling big-ticket items daily. I never forgot to place the stickers with my barcode on the products either, so when my customers checked out and it was scanned at the register, the sales should have automatically been linked to my employee ID. We don't receive commission. There are other incentives to keep our sales up. I hadn't been watching the numbers because I knew I was making sales left and right. I would have never even dreamt that I was at risk. It was just a glitch with our computer system, I decided with a nervous laugh. It had to be. Something it could probably sort out in no time. When I finally regained control of my legs, I wobbled to my manager's office. There was no miscalculation, he assured me. It was my employee ID that ranked at the bottom. The barcodes never lie, Graham. He didn't even bother making eye contact. I was circling the drain figuratively, and if I didn't get my shit together, literally, soon enough. I begged him to review the camera footage. I knew he'd be able to see me making all those sales. Don't worry, he added, with a smile vacant of anything remotely resembling happiness. One way or another, we all contribute to the success of our company. I suppose that by then, he was long desensitized to the pleas of the desperate. As I left his office, I assured myself that this wasn't a death sentence. Not yet. I had another month until they recalculated our final standings before shit would get real. Before I'd be given a limp handshake and an empty "thank you for your devotion to the company" as I was led down the hallway. Before I'd meet what lives behind the usually padlocked door in the shadowy corner of the break room. Before I'd learn what it truly meant to sacrifice myself for the good of the company. Word spread fast around the office. Kevin gave me his smug, shit-eating grin. Maybe he thought that with me out of the picture, he'd finally have a shot with Elise. Elise. I just desperately hoped that hers wouldn't be the name drawn afterwards, the one selected to hose what's left of me off the break room floor and down the stained, rusty drain. As required, I began parking in my new designated space at the far end of the employee lot, the faded sign indicating "Reserved for Employee of the Year," nearly swallowed up by the encroaching tree line. It added an extra 10 minutes to my walk to our store, and I dreaded that added time in the oppressive Texas heat. The rational part of me knew that was soon to be a moot point, though. One way or another, in another month, I wouldn't have that parking spot. If I were lucky, I'd live to see another summer, live to see some other poor bastard's car parked there. If they hadn't already heard the news, when the rest of my coworkers saw my car in that space, they knew what it meant. Don't get too attached. They started avoiding me like the plague. I didn't blame them. We all knew what would be coming next if my sales didn't improve. It's the same thing that happens every time. We'd gather for the mandatory meeting on the closing night of the fiscal year, all eyes on the sorry son of a bitch that had won. The room so quiet that you could hear their muffled sobs. They'd receive what barely constituted a handshake from my manager, while he muttered, dead-eyed, his appreciation for their devotion to the company. Next, they'd be ushered off to the break room to meet corporate. No one tried to run, not after what happened in 19. Instead, the winner would always turn back, shooting us a desperate, final look, eyes pleading for someone, anyone to intervene. And of course, no one ever did. Once the door closed behind them, and that soundproofed room swallowed up the last of their sobbing, begging, it was over. The rest of us would be sent home, and I'd try to shower away that disgusting feeling, that sick sense of relief that someone else was sent to their death, and not me. Cal, the nicest guy I'd ever met, he was the bottom performer 2 years ago. He'd fallen so ill that he'd nearly wasted away and eventually couldn't work anymore. He must have thought that freed him from his contract. If he left, if he never came back into work, he'd be okay. He must not have read the fine print in our hiring paperwork. Although, to be fair, if any of us had read it, we'd never have signed it in the first place. Cal was a warning to the rest of us that there is no quitting in our line of work. If they have to track you down and find you, and I promise you that they will find you, well, wouldn't you prefer to go with your dignity, with the company compensating your loved ones, rather than be pulled from your home, kicking and screaming into the night? Gina was Employee of the Year in 2023. Gina, with the kind smile, whom Kevin had set his sights on before Elise. And, just like Elise, she wanted nothing to do with him. I still remember that day, the day they released the final numbers. The way Gina's mouth hung open in confusion, shock. When she finally managed to form words again, she too insisted that there must be some mistake. We all vouched for her to management. I'd personally seen her make so many sales. Our manager simply reminded us that the barcodes never lie. My name was the one drawn for breakroom duty that next morning, to pick up what remained of her smile and her simple gold wedding band to be returned to her family. In one business week, they received a box containing a check and everything left of her that wouldn't fit down the drain. Once the numbers are finalized, once your employee barcode has been slapped on that innocuous-looking pink slip, well, your fate is sealed. Kevin, in all his years at the company, has never parked on the far side of the lot. He has never even come close to becoming Employee of the Year, even though he couldn't sell a bottle of water to a man dying of dehydration. He is sleaze incarnate and doesn't even have the charisma to mask it. I never understood how he did so well, but I couldn't afford to think about him. I had myself to worry about and the glitch in the system. Anytime I found myself in the break room, that ancient wooden door was an unwelcome reminder of the impending one-way trip it held for me. I took special care to keep an eye on my sales, working my ass off, pulling double shifts. I pulled up the numbers as the end of month drew near and couldn't believe it. I was still dead last. Somehow there were days where less than half of my sales had been recorded to my employee number. I didn't understand. I waited for the opportunity to sneak into the manager's office and pull the footage myself. I'd show the boss that something had gone wrong with the calculations, that the system was broken. I finally got my chance. At first, I triumphantly watched myself make sale after sale, far more than had been credited to my account. For the first time in a month, I felt a sense of relief. I had evidence, and that had to count for something. I switched feeds to the camera nearer to the registers so I could confirm that the codes were being scanned. I'd seen several scans successfully and reached to turn off the recording. That's when I saw it. Saw him. Kevin. It was subtle. I didn't realize what he was doing at first, until I recognized the pattern. Even then, I had to rewind and watch again for it to click. It happened for nearly half of my sales that day. I saw him intercepting the customers before they could check out, before I could get credit for my sales. And while he chatted them up, he discreetly slapped his employee barcode over my own. I confronted him that night. I was furious. He just smiled, smugly gave me that line about how the barcodes never lie. He didn't give a shit that he was sentencing someone else to death. Hell, maybe he even enjoyed it. Kevin had stolen credit for Gina's sales, and God knows who else's. Fucking Kevin. The day our numbers were to be finalized, he had the audacity to place his barcode over mine on a huge sale I'd made. He made no attempt at hiding it, right in front of me. He flashed me a grin as he did. I caught up with the customers before they checked out, and they kindly allowed me to peel the sticker off. I stuck it in my pocket to show my manager. I pulled the video too, and I stormed into his office, refused to leave until he watched it. I studied him as his eyes moved across the screen, and if he was upset or shocked, he certainly didn't show it. Finally, he met my eyes, and at the sight of the pain in his, well, for the first time, I felt a sense of relief. Until I realized why he looked so miserable. Until he whispered, "I'm sorry, Graham. Someone has to receive that award tomorrow. It's out of my hands." I wordlessly handed him that damn barcode sticker of Kevin's that I'd peeled off. He studied it for a long moment before he handed it back to me with a mere, "Why don't you hold on to this?" I told Elise what had happened over lunch, and as much as I appreciated her outrage on my behalf, I was already resigned to it. I'd mainly wanted to warn her because I had a sick feeling she'd be the one Kevin went after next. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't devastated when, that night, my boss called me into his office and informed me of the final standings. Yeah, I knew it was coming, but I guess it's just human nature to hold on to denial, hope, until the bitter end. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other in silence. The presence of the pink slip of paper lying on the desk between us said more than enough. Finally, my eyes drifted down to the form. He'd already signed, but the space where my barcode, the series of vertical lines spelling out my death sentence, should have been placed, was empty. I never knew how this part went, since it always took place behind closed doors. No one that ever filled out that form lived to tell the rest of us about it. "I need you to place a barcode here before I send the form to corporate," he said, eventually. I opened my mouth for one final, impassioned plea for my life, but he interrupted me. He spoke each word slowly, softly. "I'm leaving the room now. I need you to place a barcode here before I send the form to corporate." He stared at me for a long moment, waiting for my barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement before leaving me alone in the office. They processed the paperwork and announced the Employee of the Year that next day. Yes, I did feel a pang of guilt as I watched the smug grin fade, the blood drain from Kevin's face as he stared in shock at the outstretched hand of our manager, as he was thanked for his devotion to our company. I felt it again as I watched him plead all the way to the break room, as our manager spoke to him the same mantra we'd all heard before. The barcodes never lie. But I thought of Gina, of the countless others, and by the time I heard the door slam behind him, the guilt was already gone. In its place, the relief of knowing the rest of us were safe. Well, at least until next year.